Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of betrayal, deception, and a deadly obsession. This is the story of the Bonanno War, the downfall of the Bonanno family. A tale of jealousy, greed, and calculated violence. This case will leave you wondering, what lengths will someone go to when their perfect life is on the line? And how could someone so close, someone you trust, become capable of such unspeakable acts? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of the Bonanno War. Frankie the Snake Moretti, Vito The Lion Caruso, and Salvatore Sally Russo, three names once intertwined with the rise of the Bonanno family. But as betrayal, greed, and bloodshed tore them apart, one man would emerge from the wreckage to claim it all. In the war for power, where trust was a death sentence and loyalty meant nothing, who would survive the chaos? And who would be left standing when the dust settled? This is the twisted, shocking story of how Sally Russo outsmarted both Frankie and Vito to take control of the Bonanno family in a war that would change everything forever. In the heart of New York's Mafia underworld, the Bonanno crime family was a force to be reckoned with. By the 1980s, they were one of the five families of New York, with a sprawling empire that spanned everything from illegal gambling and loan sharking to drug trafficking and murder. At the helm of this powerful organization was Giovanni "Johnny Bananas" Bonanno, a man whose charm and ruthlessness had made him a legend in the criminal world. Under his rule, the family reached unprecedented heights, controlling vast territories and reaping huge profits. Johnny's rise to power had not been without its challenges, but his ability to outwit rivals and eliminate threats with precision set him apart. His trusted lieutenants, Frankie the Snake Moretti and Vito the Lion Caruso, were the pillars of his operation. Frankie was known for his smooth-talking demeanor and ability to manipulate people into doing his bidding, while Vito was a hardened enforcer whose brutal methods earned him respect and fear. Together, they helped Johnny cement his family's dominance in Brooklyn, securing their wealth and influence over the years. As the years passed, the Bonanno family thrived, but the cracks beneath the surface started to widen. By 1984, Johnny's once sharp instincts began to dull, and he struggled with health issues that made him less active in the day-to-day operations. Despite his declining strength, Johnny still held the reins, but it was clear that his grip on the family was loosening. This power vacuum didn't go unnoticed. Frankie and Vito, the two men who had been instrumental in Johnny's success, helping him build a vast criminal network across New York City, began to see their opportunities for greater control. What was once loyalty was now a competition for dominance. Frankie had long been the face of the family's operations, with his silver tongue and manipulative nature, had always been Johnny's trusted confidant, guiding the family's operations with a deft hand. His charming demeanor and sharp intellect made him an effective leader in the world of organized crime. He had orchestrated many of the family's most lucrative deals, but beneath his suave exterior, there was a growing hunger for more power. Frankie believed that Johnny's failing health was a sign that the time was right for him to step up and take control. He had helped Johnny rise to the top, but now it was his turn to lead. Frankie had long been loyal, but loyalty in the Mafia world was a fragile thing, easily shattered by ambition. Vito, on the other hand, was more methodical and calculating, a man of brute force and ruthless tactics. A man of action, Vito built his power base slowly, quietly gathering a loyal group of men who trusted his brutal approach. Vito's approach was simple: eliminate anyone who stood in his way and show no mercy to those who betrayed the family. Unlike Frankie, who preferred to use persuasion and charm to get what he wanted, Vito used violence and intimidation. He believed that a family should be ruled with an iron fist, and he had no patience for Johnny's increasingly erratic decision-making. Vito's ambitions were no secret to those around him. He had been positioning himself for years, waiting for the moment when he could take the reins for himself. His fierce loyalty to Johnny was unquestioned, but as the years wore on, Vito began to see Johnny as weak. Johnny's inability to handle the family's growing empire and his reliance on Frankie made Vito uncomfortable. He didn't trust Frankie's soft touch and believed the family needed a leader who could take control with iron-fisted authority. Vito was convinced that his way was the only way forward. However, the growing tension between Frankie and Vito did not go unnoticed. Even within the family, there were whispers of discontent and rivalry. The two men, once allies, were now vying for the same prize, control of the Bonanno family. As Johnny's influence waned, their rivalry intensified, and it was only a matter of time before their ambitions collided. The family, which had once been united under Johnny's leadership, now found itself divided by the rising ambitions of two of its most trusted men. Amidst this brewing conflict, Salvatore Sally Russo, a young associate who had been working for the family for years, saw an opportunity to advance his own position. Sally had always been an observer, watching the dynamics of the family from the sidelines, carefully calculating his next move. He was a man of few words, but he had a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for survival. Unlike Frankie and Vito, who were consumed by their thirst for power, Sally played the long game. He knew that in the world of organized crime, loyalty was a commodity that could be bought and sold. He also understood that the most dangerous men were those who could bide their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sally had always admired Johnny Bananas, but he saw the cracks in the family structure. He knew that Johnny's time at the top was coming to an end, and he was positioning himself to take advantage of the chaos that was sure to follow. The family was on the brink of a power struggle, and Sally was determined to make sure that when the dust settled, he would be on top. Sally knew how to stay out of the spotlight, biding his time and collecting information, knowing that knowledge was the most dangerous weapon in the world of organized crime. But what Sally didn't realize was that his involvement in the growing conflict would put him in the crossfire of a deadly war between two powerful factions. He had become a player in a game he didn't fully understand, and soon his survival would depend on his ability to outsmart everyone around him. As Johnny clung to the remnants of his empire, he remained blissfully unaware of the brewing storm. The power struggle that was unfolding behind his back would soon consume the family, and no one would emerge unscathed. The stage was set for a war that would destroy the Bonanno family from within, a war that would see betrayal, bloodshed, and a battle for control that would leave everyone questioning who could be trusted. Johnny's empire was on the verge of collapse, and the only question left was who would be the one to claim the ashes of the Bonanno family for themselves. At first, Sally remained loyal to Johnny, but he could sense that the family's days were numbered. He had seen the growing tension between Frankie and Vito and realized that the old order was crumbling. He understood that no one would remain untouched by the fallout. Sally knew that the best way to survive the coming chaos was to position himself in the middle of the conflict. He started to feed Frankie and Vito information, playing both sides to his advantage, all while maintaining the appearance of being loyal to the family. While Frankie and Vito fought for control, they each sought to consolidate their power by recruiting their own loyalists. Frankie worked to gain favor with key players within the family, using his charm and connections to create a network of supporters. Vito, in contrast, relied on fear and loyalty. He demanded unquestioning allegiance from those who served him, punishing anyone who even hinted at betrayal. Neither man knew that Sally was working both sides, feeding them intelligence while carefully choosing what to keep to himself. Sally had become the ultimate puppet master, pulling the strings behind the scenes, all the while maintaining the trust of both factions. As 1985 drew to a close, the tension between Frankie and Vito reached a breaking point. Both men knew that the time had come to make their move. Frankie believed he had the advantage, having gained control over several key members of the family's operations. He had the charisma and the connections to rally support, and believed that once Johnny was out of the picture, the family would follow his lead. But Vito, with his violent reputation and loyal soldiers, was ready for a confrontation. He knew that his method of control, brutal and unyielding, was what the family needed, and he wasn't about to let Frankie take what he believed was rightfully his. Behind the scenes, Sally's machinations continued. He fed Frankie crucial details about Vito's movements, while at the same time he made sure Vito knew of Frankie's every step. He played both men against each other, slowly building the perfect storm. But Sally's plans were becoming more dangerous by the day. As he moved deeper into the heart of the family's conflict, he began to realize that his position was becoming increasingly precarious. The two men who had once trusted him were now each preparing for the ultimate betrayal. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching, and the Bonanno family stood on the brink of collapse. Neither Frankie nor Vito could afford to back down, and as they prepared to make their final move, they were unaware that the true architect of their downfall was the man who had been feeding them the very information that would lead them to destroy each other. The war was about to begin, and in its wake, the Bonanno family would never be the same. By late 1985, the tension within the Bonanno family had become unbearable. The delicate balance of power that had once held the family together was now fractured beyond repair. Johnny Bonanno, the aging leader who had once united them, was increasingly sidelined, his influence evaporating with each passing day. As Johnny's health continued to deteriorate, the struggle for control between his two most trusted lieutenants, Frankie The Snake Moretti and Vito The Lion Caruso, reached a fever pitch. Both men knew that the time had come to make their move, and neither was willing to wait any longer. As Frankie and Vito prepared to move against each other, both knew that the family's stability was hanging by a thread. Each man saw the other as a threat, and neither was willing to back down. The conflict between them would not remain confined to their inner circle. It would spill into the streets of Brooklyn, where both men had built their power bases. The city's underworld would soon become the battleground for the Bonanno family's future. The first real sign of the impending conflict came when Frankie, confident in his position, attempted to eliminate Vito once and for all. He arranged a meeting with several of Vito's key men under the guise of negotiating a truce. But the meeting was a trap, a calculated move to take out Vito and his loyalists in one fell swoop. Frankie had planned everything meticulously: the location, the timing, the men involved, but he had failed to account for one thing: Vito's own ability to foresee such moves. Vito, ever the tactician, had been watching Frankie closely and had already anticipated the betrayal. As Frankie's men moved in to ambush Vito, they found themselves caught in a vicious counterattack. Vito's soldiers, armed and ready, launched a brutal assault, catching Frankie's crew off guard. A bloody shootout erupted in a quiet Brooklyn alley, with gunfire echoing through the streets. Frankie's men were overwhelmed, and by the time the dust settled, several of his closest associates were dead, and Frankie was left wounded but alive. Frankie's plans had failed spectacularly. His careful strategy had backfired, and Vito had gained the upper hand. But the cost of the skirmish was not just in lives lost, it was in the damage done to the fragile unity within the Bonanno family. The shootout in the alley was only the beginning. The war between Frankie and Vito was now public, and every soldier in the family had to choose a side. The streets of Brooklyn would soon be filled with blood as the two factions fought for supremacy. Sally, who had been feeding both sides information, saw his opportunity to strike. With both factions at war, he knew that the family would be weakened. It was the perfect time for him to make his move. But Sally also knew that he was playing a dangerous game. As the conflict between Frankie and Vito escalated, he became a target for both sides. The stakes had never been higher, and Sally understood that his survival depended on his ability to stay one step ahead of both men. The Bonanno family was no longer just an empire built on crime and violence. It was a powder keg waiting to explode, with betrayal and bloodshed as its foundation. As the war raged on, it became clear that the family's days were numbered, and at the center of it all was Sally Russo, whose quiet ambition had put him in the position to become the last man standing. But in a world built on lies and treachery, no one could ever be sure who would come out on top. The war between Frankie the Snake Moretti and Vito the Lion Caruso escalated quickly as the Bonanno family found itself plunged into chaos. After the bloody confrontation in Brooklyn, both men became increasingly determined to crush the other. It was no longer a matter of rivalry, it was survival. The once united family had fractured beyond repair, and now every decision carried life or death consequences. With both factions scrambling for power, the streets of Brooklyn became a battleground where loyalty was tested, alliances were formed and broken, and betrayal became the norm. Frankie's initial defeat at the hands of Vito only hardened his resolve. He couldn't afford to lose the war, not after everything he had worked for. Vito's violent counterattack had sent a clear message: only the strongest would remain standing. Frankie understood that now more than ever. He began consolidating his power, rallying the remaining soldiers loyal to him, while seeking to undermine Vito's position at every turn. However, he knew that brute force alone wouldn't win the war. He needed strategy, cunning, and information. This is where Salvatore Sally Russo came into play. Sally had played both sides for far too long, feeding crucial intelligence to Frankie and Vito alike. But now, with the war intensifying, his position had grown more dangerous. Sally was no longer just a shadow in the background. He had become a pivotal player in the battle for control of the Bonanno family. He understood that the key to winning was not only to outsmart his rivals but to manipulate them into thinking they held the upper hand. He was the puppet master, and Frankie and Vito were his puppets, each unknowingly helping to set the stage for his rise. As the weeks passed, both Frankie and Vito struggled to gain the upper hand. Frankie's network of loyalists, though extensive, began to fracture under pressure. He couldn't maintain his grip on all the territories he once controlled. Vito, meanwhile, continued to expand his influence, using his enforcers to eliminate Frankie's remaining supporters. Vito's ruthless approach was paying off. The more bloodshed he caused, the more terrified Frankie's men became, and soon Frankie was left with only a handful of soldiers who were either too loyal or too afraid to leave. But as the conflict raged on, something shifted in Sally's mind. He had spent years quietly watching the Bonanno family, learning its inner workings, calculating his moves. Now, with both Frankie and Vito preoccupied with their war, Sally saw an opportunity to rise to the top. He knew that the family's power would soon be up for grabs, and he was willing to do whatever it took to claim it. The time had come for him to make his move. Sally's first step was to further sow discord between Frankie and Vito. He fed Frankie false information, making him believe that Vito was planning to strike a covert deal with rival families to strengthen his position. At the same time, Sally whispered in Vito's ear, telling him that Frankie was secretly trying to form an alliance with outside forces, preparing to betray him at the first chance. Both men, blinded by their distrust for each other, took the bait. Each of them prepared for what they believed was the other's final betrayal. They moved faster, with even more violence and suspicion, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The streets of Brooklyn became littered with bodies as the war took a toll on both sides. The Bonanno family's power was slipping away, and it seemed only a matter of time before either Frankie or Vito would emerge victorious. But Sally, ever patient and calculating, knew that victory for either man would only set the stage for his own rise to power. He had always understood that in the world of organized crime, it was the ones who played the long game that came out on top. He had no intention of merely surviving this war, he intended to win it. Sally's careful manipulation of both sides was paying off. As the pressure mounted, Frankie's and Vito's already fragile alliances began to fall apart. Men who had once been loyal to them were now questioning their decisions. In the midst of all this chaos, Sally appeared as the only figure who had managed to remain untouched by the violence. While the two rivals waged war, Sally quietly expanded his own base of supporters, carefully choosing who to trust and who to eliminate. He was building a network of allies, many of whom had once been loyal to either Frankie or Vito, but now saw Sally as the only way to survive. Frankie, now more isolated than ever, made one last attempt to strike a decisive blow against Vito. He called for a meeting of his remaining men, hoping to regroup and mount one final attack. However, what Frankie didn't know was that Sally had already tipped off Vito. The moment Frankie's men gathered, they found themselves surrounded by Vito's enforcers, waiting in ambush. It was a trap. In the ensuing chaos, Frankie was once again left scrambling, his forces decimated by Vito's superior numbers. For the first time in the war, Vito had dealt a crushing blow to his rival. But the war was far from over. Vito's victory, however sweet, only left him more vulnerable. As he celebrated his success, Sally took advantage of the power vacuum, slipping further into the shadows to quietly gain control of the remaining factions. The family's infighting had weakened it beyond repair, and in the coming days, the question was no longer about who would win the war, it was about who would be left standing when the dust settled. Sally's long game was nearing its end, and with both Frankie and Vito exhausted from their battle, it seemed inevitable that he would soon emerge as the sole power in the Bonanno family. But just as he was ready to take control, he realized something that could jeopardize everything. The family was on the brink of collapse, and in its ashes, the future of the Bonanno family was anything but certain. Would Sally be able to secure his dominance, or would the family's collapse drag him down as well? The downfall of the Bonanno family had become a spectacle of destruction. What had once been a powerful, untouchable criminal empire was now reduced to a fragmented collection of warring factions. Both Frankie the Snake Moretti and Vito the Lion Caruso had fought relentlessly, but in the end their shared bloodshed had left the family weakened and fractured. The streets of Brooklyn were painted with blood, and loyalty had become a rare commodity. Amid this chaos, Salvatore Sally Russo had quietly positioned himself as the last man standing. As the war between Frankie and Vito raged on, Sally knew the moment of reckoning was near. Both of his rivals were exhausted. Frankie, despite his years of careful planning, had been broken by Vito's ruthless tactics and his own failing network of supporters. Vito, though victorious in many of their battles, had suffered considerable losses too. His enforcers were spread thin, and the constant bloodshed had made even the most loyal soldiers question whether the war was worth the cost. The Bonanno family, once a force to be reckoned with, was now a hollow shell of its former self. The question on everyone's mind was no longer who would win, but whether anyone would emerge with enough strength to carry the legacy forward. Sally knew this was his chance. His strategy had been subtle, his manipulations masterful. While Frankie and Vito destroyed each other, Sally had quietly gathered power, cultivating alliances with remaining loyalists who had once pledged allegiance to either rival. He positioned himself as the only leader capable of restoring order, someone who had stayed untouched by the chaos, someone who knew how to play the game better than anyone else. As the war reached its boiling point, Sally started making moves that would forever shift the balance of power. The first step in his plan was to eliminate any lingering threats. While Frankie and Vito fought to the death, Sally used his influence to quietly orchestrate the removal of key individuals who could pose a threat to his rise. These men were once loyal to either of the two factions, but now they were nothing more than liabilities to Sally's vision. He had already ensured that both Frankie and Vito were too distracted with their own wars to notice the subtle shifts happening within their ranks. The enforcers who had once worked for Frankie and Vito now found themselves working for Sally, some out of fear, others because they saw the writing on the wall. Whoever controlled the remnants of the Bonanno family would be the one left standing in the end. Sally's first big move came when he brokered a deal with some of Vito's most trusted lieutenants. He promised them power and protection, things neither Frankie nor Vito could provide in the face of their mutual destruction. With Vito's soldiers now on his side, Sally knew the time had come to deal the final blow. He had been biding his time, watching, listening, and planning every step carefully. With the fractured Bonanno family all but powerless, Sally moved swiftly to consolidate his control. The war between Frankie and Vito had already left many of their loyalists questioning their futures. As the bloodshed continued, more and more men defected to Sally's side, seeing him as the only one who could bring an end to the violence. His quiet but effective leadership began to resonate with the remaining members of the Bonanno family, who were tired of war and loss. They saw Sally as the man who could rebuild, restore, and lead them into a new era. And Sally knew that he was their best chance at survival. After all, it wasn't loyalty to Frankie or Vito that kept these men in the game, it was the promise of power. And Sally was the only one left with any to offer. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Frankie made one last attempt to rally his dwindling forces. He believed that if he could eliminate Vito once and for all, he could restore his position as the true leader of the Bonanno family. But by the time Frankie launched his final attack, it was already too late. Sally had quietly taken control of the key territories that Frankie had once ruled. When Frankie's forces moved in to strike at Vito's stronghold, they found themselves facing not only Vito's men but Sally's as well. The confrontation turned into a bloodbath, with Frankie's soldiers outnumbered and overwhelmed. His last-ditch effort failed, and he was forced to flee for his life. Vito, too, had been caught off guard. Sally had maneuvered so expertly that Vito never saw the danger until it was too late. With Frankie out of the picture, Sally's forces quickly surrounded Vito's compound. Vito, who had once prided himself on his ability to control through fear, found himself cornered. His remaining men had lost faith, and those who still stood by him were no match for Sally's growing army. In a matter of hours, Vito's empire crumbled. He was taken into custody, his reign overthrown, and his power stripped away. The Bonanno family, now in shambles, had no one left to lead them except Sally. He had outsmarted both Frankie and Vito, using their pride and their egos against them. The family's once great empire was now his to command. But as Sally looked over the remains of what had once been a thriving criminal syndicate, he realized that taking control was only the first step. The family, what was left of it, would never be the same. The loyalty that had once bound them was now gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty. Sally had won, but at what cost? The Bonanno family was no longer the powerhouse it had once been. The streets of Brooklyn were still filled with whispers of betrayal and destruction, and Sally's rule would never be as stable as those of the men who had come before him. The question now was whether Sally could rebuild the empire or whether he, too, would fall victim to the same betrayal that had brought down Johnny, Frankie, and Vito. One thing was certain: the story of the Bonanno family was far from over, and in the world of organized crime, no one could ever truly be safe from the cost of their own ambition. Thank you for joining us here at Mystery Minds as we unraveled the twisted saga of the Banana War, the downfall of the Bonanno family, a tale of power, betrayal, and the brutal cost of ambition. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new case. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep questioning the world around you.